Great, thanks Monique, and thanks everybody for coming. Hoping to spend the next 40 to 45 minutes talking about some work that we've been doing here at the Institute, measuring occupational health and safety vulnerability more broadly, and then specifically today about work in the last 6 or 7 months looking at that vulnerability among new immigrants here in Ontario and Kingston. The work builds on a broader research agenda that includes a number of researchers here, but the work today specifically is work by myself, Iggy Cosney, and Peter Smith in partnership with 4 organizations. The work that we're presenting here is supported by the Ministry of Labour's Research Opportunity Program as well as CIHR. So I'm going to start off with giving a quick background on what we know about occupational health and safety of immigrants, new and recent immigrants here in Ontario and Canada, as well as a quick backgrounder on the occupational health and safety vulnerability measure. Then I'll tell you a little bit about the data collection and survey administration that we're focused on in this presentation, share the results, and then wrap up with a few conclusions and a description of what comes next. So a little bit of background on occupational health and safety of immigrants. Immigrants play a big and important role in both population growth in Canada and in the labour market. So immigration factors about 2/3 of the population growth happening in Canada. And about 7% of the labour force in Canada is made up of immigrants that have arrived within the last 10 years. Despite that important factor, we don't know a whole lot about their workplace experiences. Past research by many IWH researchers has told us that immigrants are more likely than Canadian-born workers to be in high-risk job situations, so temporary work contracts, small workplaces, in non-unionized positions. That after a week-long work absence, they're less likely to be compensated for that time lost, and that immigrant men are at higher risk of work injuries that require medical attention.
Higher risk than?
Ontarians and Canadians. So as a result of these increased risks and the experiences, that what we know, immigrants are often described under this larger rubric of vulnerable workers. They make up part of that. And in the past, vulnerability in the workplace has really been measured by focusing on certain population and occupational groups, like immigrants or young workers or new workers. The measure that I'm going to share a little bit about here is designed to move away from focusing on those population groups and instead focus on context and workplace circumstances that place individuals at increased risk. So the 27-question measure that was developed here at IWH focuses on 4 dimensions of occupational risk. The first of occupational vulnerability, rather. The first is the level of hazards a worker experiences. The second is the workplace policies and procedures that are in place to protect workers. The third is a worker's awareness of hazards on their job and their rights and responsibilities in the workplace. And the fourth is their empowerment to participate in prevention in the workplace. So the measure that has been developed here includes questions on each of these dimensions. 11 questions on asking a worker how frequently they're exposed to different types of workplace hazards. So things from working at height to exposure to chemicals and or harassment on the job. 7 questions that ask a worker to reflect on the policies and procedures in place in their workplace. So how quickly does an incident get reported and dealt with? Is there a functioning health and safety committee in place in the workplace? 6 questions about a worker's awareness of their rights and responsibilities, their employer's rights and responsibilities, and the hazards that they encounter on the job. And 5 questions about their empowerment in their workplace to participate actively in protecting themselves and keeping the workplace safe. So those include questions about whether they feel as though they have enough time to complete their jobs, or whether they feel as though they could speak up about concerns they have in the workplace. So using these 4 dimensions, we've defined occupational health and safety vulnerability as I guess there's a 2-part definition here. First, people are exposed to hazards on their jobs, so report frequent exposure, and they have either inadequate workplace policies and procedures, low occupational health and safety awareness, or low empowerment. So there's a dual element to the way we've come to understand vulnerability. So as you can see at the bottom right there, the most vulnerable are those who are both exposed to hazards and have an inadequate, and report inadequacy on one of those 3 types of protections. And the advantage here, one of the advantages here of this measure is that we're able to look at policies and procedures vulnerability separate from awareness vulnerability, separate from empowerment vulnerability, which is allowing us to better understand some of the levers where we might be able to implement policies or projects to better protect different groups of workers. So we've used this measure in the past to examine how different groups often described as vulnerable experience different types of vulnerability. So in this case, we've looked at the relationship between workplace size and vulnerability. So from left to right, you have policy and procedure vulnerability, awareness vulnerability, and then empowerment vulnerability. And you'll see the most dramatic differences are related to these blue bars. So policies and procedure vulnerability, which I think, whereas in awareness vulnerability, the impact of workplace size is less pronounced. This is one way in which we've used the vulnerability measure to identify areas, targeted areas where prevention activities might be best focused. Another group that we've had an opportunity to look at is the difference in vulnerability between permanent and temporary workers. So again, from left to right, policy to procedure vulnerability, awareness vulnerability, and empowerment vulnerability. And here we see a difference between the vulnerability experienced by permanent and temporary workers exists in all 3, across all 3 dimensions, slightly different than the previous slide where the most pronounced difference was in policies and procedure vulnerability. So one of the things we've learned so far is that different groups, often all included under this umbrella of vulnerable workers, experience different types of vulnerability. In our previous research, we hadn't had a chance to look to focus on the experiences of recent immigrants, and that's partly because the sample that we had very few of those, didn't scoop up as many recent immigrants as we'd hoped. So the last fall, we partnered with 4 settlement agencies here in Toronto and Kingston to look more closely at the vulnerability experiences of new immigrants. So from September to November, we recruited just shy of 200 participants through these 4 organizations. We worked with research assistants at each one of them who recruited from their clients in the classroom setting or on a one-on-one basis to complete the survey. We had both an English and a Spanish version of the survey available, about 20 of the 200, so just shy of 10% completed that survey in Spanish. And we were able to, like I said, capture just shy of 200 workers who were over 15 years old, who were working or had Canadian work experience in the previous 10 months and had been in Canada for 5 years or less. There's a little asterisk at the bottom there because we found as we began recruitment that it was difficult to find workers who had both work experience in Canada and had been here for less than 5 years. So in the end, we ended up accepting anyone who had been in the country for 10 years or less. So who did we hear from in this survey? We heard from nearly 60% of who we heard from were women. The largest age group that we heard from were age 25 to 34. And over 50%, interestingly, had a bachelor's degree or more. And that I think is partly a reflection of the changing nature of the immigrant population. In the last 30 years, we've seen a shift from mostly family-based immigrants to more and more skilled workers that are coming to Canada. That's not necessarily reflected in who we spoke to, that general trend. Most of who we spoke to described themselves as family, having arrived through the family class. Though many of the business class or other in this category are skilled workers who report themselves as skilled workers or are here under temporary work visas. The majority of who we spoke to had been in Canada under 5 years. And over 50% described their English competency as, spoken English competency as being able to speak English well or very well. The majority of our sample, or 40% of our sample rather, were working full-time, and just over 20% had worked within the last year but were not currently working when we surveyed them. Most worked in small workplaces with less than 20 employees. The vast majority were not union members, and just over 50% reported being in temporary work relationships. What sectors did these participants work in? Most reported working in sales and services, which includes both restaurant work and housekeeping responsibilities. And then the second most common was education, law, social and government services, and I think that most often captured people who are working in home care settings. So when we look at who we spoke to in this immigrant sample compared to a sample that we collected of Ontario workers at the same time, our immigrant sample was more often female. They were younger. They were more often highly educated, so more often had a bachelor's degree or above. They were more often employed in smaller workplaces, more often in temporary work relationships, and less likely to be union members. So the sample that, the Ontario sample that we're comparing here to was collected by a third-party survey company during the same time period as we were collecting this data, and it captured individuals working in workplaces with more than 5 employees, more than 15 hours a week, and who had been in Canada for 10 years or more. So as we go through, there'll be more comparisons between the immigrant sample and this Ontario sample. That gives you a sense of who we're comparing to.
So to clarify, the Ontario sample isn't a representative sample.
That's true, yeah. One of the series of questions we had a chance to ask the immigrant sample, and some of these questions came as a result of conversations with our partner organizations, were about employment standard experiences and some additional job characteristics. So just under 10% of the immigrant workers we spoke with reported their employers failing to pay their wages at some point. Almost 20% described not having a regular pay day. And 15% spoke, or just above 15% reported often or always working more than 5 hours without a break. 1 in 10 described having more than one job. And 30% remarked that the work in Canada they were doing was similar to that back home. So 2/3 were doing work here in Canada that was not related to what they had done before arriving. In both the immigrant and the Ontario survey, we asked individuals to reflect on workplace injuries in the previous 12 months. So we can see across the bottom those reporting a physical injury or illness as a result of work, a mental injury or illness as a result of work, an injury requiring medical attention or time off, and then we also asked them whether they were worried about being injured on the job. So significant differences we see here are that the immigrant and refugee population that we spoke with report less often mental injury or illness due to work and injury and illness requiring time off. I think this speaks a little bit to challenges in measuring injury, and particularly related to injury requiring time off. The dramatic difference there could be that people or immigrants working in jobs that they are very tied to and economically dependent on are less likely to take the time off that they need. So their injuries may be of equivalent concern, but they wouldn't report them as injuries requiring time off. And then we asked a question about, are you getting occupational health and safety training, and are you aware of the mandatory training here in Ontario? In both cases, the immigrant population was statistically less likely to have received training in the previous 12 months and to be aware of the occupational health and safety training. So, and I think it's also worth noting that in Ontario, just 2/3 of the population report having received occupational health and safety training, and only 3/4 are aware that it's required. So. And then one additional question that came from our partners was to ask, how are immigrants receiving information about occupational health and safety, their rights and responsibilities on the job? And for most of them, they're depending on their employer for that information. And in some cases, some less frequent cases, their friends or government documents and resources. But it doesn't seem as though settlement agencies are the primary delivery mechanism for occupational health and safety information. So, and what about occupational health and safety vulnerability? So the focus of this survey, after all these questions, was to examine this two-part definition of vulnerability. So just to remind you, we defined occupational health and safety vulnerability. So someone is most vulnerable if they are both exposed to hazards and experience one of these three other things. So inadequate policies and procedures, low occupational health and safety awareness, or low empowerment to actively participate in protecting themselves. When we look at each of those dimensions individually, we see some significant differences. On the left-hand side, you can see that immigrants and refugees compared to this Ontario sample are statistically more likely to report hazard exposure. So we defined hazard exposure as those individuals who report weekly or more common or more frequent exposure to at least 2 of the 9 measures of hazards, or they report weekly exposure to harassment, work at heights, heavy lifting, or work with chemicals. And then along the far side are those who report inadequate policies and procedures, inadequate awareness, or inadequate empowerment. And we defined each of those as individuals, so they were asked a series of questions I described earlier, and asked to agree or disagree. And if they disagreed with one of those statements, we considered them to have inadequate protection. So they disagreed with the fact that there was an active Health and Safety Committee. We would then classify them as having inadequate policies and procedures. So there are no statistical differences in the levels of inadequate, of any of those 3 inadequate dimensions, though I think that there are important differences, particularly related to the inadequate empowerment. There's an 8.5% difference there, and I think that's meaningful, if not statistically different. So again, just as a reminder, we've used these 2 dimensions to split the participants into 3 groups. The least vulnerable being those who are neither exposed to hazards or are not exposed to hazards, but also describe having adequate protections. The somewhat vulnerable are either not exposed and have inadequate protections, or are exposed and describe adequate protections. And then our most vulnerable group being those who face hazards on a day-to-day basis and report not having the mitigation resources to protect themselves. So on this slide is the distribution across these 3 categories of each type of vulnerability. So you'll see on the left policies and procedure vulnerability. The dark lines being immigrants and refugees. So there are more immigrants and refugees in the most vulnerable category than there are Ontarians. That difference is not statistically important, though I think one of the highlights is that this least vulnerable category, there's a big difference there. So those workers who describe no hazards and adequate protections, there are dramatically more in the Ontario population than there are in the immigrant population. And we see a similar pattern in awareness-related vulnerability, where the difference in the percentage of most vulnerable workers is not statistically different, but there's an important difference in those who are least, which means there are more immigrants and refugees at plausible risk than there are Ontarians. And then in a very different pattern in the empowerment section of vulnerability, we see that there are statistically more immigrants who we would describe as most vulnerable than there are Ontarians. And the converse is true of least vulnerable. There are statistically more Ontarians who we would describe as least vulnerable than there are in the immigrant population that we interviewed. So building on these first graphs, we then fit a number of relative risk models to compare the experiences of immigrants and the Ontarian population in the three types of vulnerability: policies and procedure vulnerability, awareness vulnerability, and empowerment vulnerability. So I'll show you the results of a series of models, the first being a crude comparison. The second is adjusted for age, gender, and education level to see whether the differences that we see in the crude models can be explained by differences in the population composition. And the third model is further adjusted, so not only adjusted for age, gender, and education level, but also for workplace size, union membership, and employment relationship, again to see whether the differences in vulnerability can be explained by the workplaces immigrants are in. So on the left are the series of models for the policies and procedures vulnerability, and then on the right, awareness vulnerability. I think in both these we don't see significant differences in the adjusted models, but I think it's important to note that the effect size is high, and that while the differences are not significant, there is an elevated, even after adjustment, there is an elevated risk of both policies and procedure vulnerability and awareness vulnerability in the immigrant population. And then differently, in the empowerment vulnerability, we see significant elevated levels of empowerment vulnerability when we compare the immigrant population to our Ontario sample. So both at the crude and both adjusted models, we see that immigrants are more likely to experience empowerment-related vulnerability. And then in this final one, a final measure is our overall vulnerability. So that is anyone experiencing any type of the three vulnerabilities combined together. But I think, as I mentioned previously, the value of this measure is that we're able to break apart the types of vulnerability to better target or better understand the complexities of the workplace. So I've sped through this, but a couple of takeaways from the work that we've been doing. The first is that new immigrants report exposure to hazards in the workplace more often than Ontarians. And this, I think, reflects similar conclusions that have been found in earlier research. That low empowerment is an important driver of occupational health and safety vulnerability in new immigrants. So the biggest, the most significant differences in vulnerability that we've seen are in that empowerment-related dimension. And that there is an important takeaway is that understanding these dual drivers, so both hazard exposure and low empowerment, can help us to identify tailored opportunities to reduce risk. Which again I think loops nicely back to the first lesson that we've learned in this work, is that different groups experience different types of vulnerability, and that describing a large umbrella vulnerable population doesn't necessarily allow us to find the solutions that we need. And then finally, a couple of caveats about the work that we've done here. There are, as we mentioned earlier, both these surveys are voluntary, and as a result, we have some selection bias. The immigrant sample that we took are those who have made use of immigrant settlement agencies. They're perhaps the better connected to resources, and they're most certainly those who are most comfortable operating in English or Spanish. So it's possible that we have not had a chance to sample the most vulnerable workers in that subpopulation. In the Ontario sample, that was captured using from a panel of individuals who have opted in to complete surveys. And it's also likely that those who are most willing to speak about their occupational health and safety experiences might also be those who have been injured most recently. It's an issue that's top of mind, and they're happy to talk about it. As a result, some of the differences that we've highlighted here could be conservative estimates. If we've captured both those who are Ontarians who are most likely to have been injured and those immigrant samples who are least vulnerable, these might be conservative look at the differences between the two. There are some challenges with recall bias. We've asked people to remember their experiences in the preceding 12 months, and in the case of immigrants, those of them who are not working, to remember their last job in Canada. So I think that there's some challenges related to that memory. And then it is a cross-sectional study, so what we can offer here are associations rather than causal connections. And that's maybe most relevant to the injury questions. We can't tell you that the vulnerability preceded injury, just that they're both, that we've captured both in this snapshot. If you want to learn more about the work that we've been doing on occupational health and safety vulnerability, there's a couple of publications available that you'll be able to access online. And recently, the KTE team has put together a vulnerability tool that's now available on the IWH website, where workplaces or interested parties could use this survey themselves to better understand the vulnerability in their work environments. So with that, I'll happily answer any questions.